When Darwin was first forming his ideas about evolution, he was really interested in the origin of species, or the process by which species form, which is called speciation. Just write that definition here. In previous videos, I've talked about microevolution and how natural selection and other microevolutionary forces like genetic drift and migration can lead to changes within a gene pool. Whether or not that microevolution will lead to a new species depends on a lot of other things. So microevolution is really a separate process where we get changes within a gene pool, or we could also say within a species. And in some cases, microevolution can lead to species formation and what we call macroevolution. But again, I want to qualify that with sometimes, because microevolution is also always happening, but many, many, many times it does not lead to new species formation. So the roots here, macro and micro, have significance. So microevolution is saying at a smaller level. So again, within a single population. Whereas macro means large and is saying that this is evolution at a larger level where we're actually forming new species and groups of species. And macroevolution is what gets us the diversity of organisms, right? So having lots of different species as evolution has occurred over thousands and millions of years. So again, speciation is a term that describes, or is the term that means the formation of new species. And if we look at Earth today, the sort of a 4.5 billion year time frame of speciation, there's 1.75 million species that have been identified on Earth. So those that have actually been seen by scientists and been named by people. The estimates on how many unidentified species is huge. They're ranging from 2 to 100 million. So really depending on the person and what organisms you're looking at, bacteria especially, it's really hard to predict how many there could be. So a reasonable estimate is probably that there's at least 5 and probably anywhere up to 50 million species here on Earth today. Again, after 4.5 billion years of time on Earth. So when we're talking about species, a big issue that we have to address is, well, what do we determine to be a species, or how do we know that we have identified a new species? And when we say, okay, we've identified this many species, what does that mean? And so to start answering that question, I want you to take a look at these two pictures here. So here's a bird on your left and a bird on your right. And the question is, are these different species? So taking a look at these, and so our first instinct is to really think about appearance when we're thinking about species. So we see here a bird that is all one color, where this bird is 2 different colors. We see perhaps a difference in size. We see perhaps a difference in color of the beak. So a lot of different things that we might see as different between these two birds. And so again, that is one way, and certainly one of our instinctual ways to start trying to identify species. But it can actually be quite tricky to determine a different species. And so in this case, I'll go ahead and tell you that these are actually the same species. This is a mature bald eagle, and this is an immature bald eagle. So they actually don't get this distinctive white head until they're older. And so appearance is not something that we can rely on as a way to determine species, even though it can sometimes help you. So in reality, depending on the type of organism you're looking at, we have to use different ways to identify species. So for some organisms, the looks can help us. In some organisms, we might have to look at the DNA. In some organisms, we might consider where they live. In other circumstances, we might consider who they can breed with. In other circumstances, we really just have to try and figure out their evolutionary history. and use that to figure out whether it's a different species. So that's a list of some of the ways that we determine speciation. And even when we have used these categories, it can still be tricky to determine species. And so you see a growing use of the subspecies classification. A common one where this has happened is the dog versus the wolf. So the distinction, whether or not there are different species, has been really tricky to decide. And so we've gone with a subspecies classification for dogs rather than a separate species designation. And so notice that I've said now, we decide, right? So in some respects, whether something is a species or not is kind of semantics. That is a human distinction. Organisms out in the wild, they do what they do. They're going to mate with whoever they're going to mate with. They're going to interact with whoever they're going to interact with. They're not asking, am I a species or not? They really have no concern about that. So this is really a very human-centric definition, and it does have some consequences in nature. And so we'll talk in particular about this ability to interbreed being something that where our definition of a species does have a big influence on the behavior of organisms. So a last note here, what would you predict would have more differences in characteristics? Species that diverged evolutionarily 5 million years ago or species that diverged 1 million years ago? And so you should predict to see more differences if they diverged 5 million years ago compared to 1 million years ago. So more differences if separated by more time. And I want to highlight that because that underpins the way we think about a lot of stuff in evolution. And when we think about species or even microevolution, like if we're thinking about different morphological traits, the longer two different species have been their own species, we'd expect more differences in traits. We'd expect more differences in their DNA. We'd expect them to live in different areas. And we might expect that they've acquired differences in their breeding.